Welcome to the WSET D5 Fortified Wine Book, read by Sam Stacy. Again, I have no credit for writing this or doing any of the work other than I like to read and I like to listen to my study materials. So I'm reading so I can listen to my study materials later, and I just thought I'd share the recording with you in case you like to be read to as well. So, Chapter 3, Sherry. Sherry is a fortified wine comprising a variety of different styles that range from dry to sweet. They're made in the area around the city of Jerez in Andalusia, Spain. This area has a long history of growing grapes and producing wines dating to the rule of the Phoenicians, who settled in the area around 1000 BCE. The first mention of sherry is from 100 BCE. The period of Moorish rule from the 8th to the 13th centuries meant wine consumption was prohibited, but grape growing and wine production still took place. After Jerez came under Christian rule in the 13th century, both domestic consumption and exports grew rapidly as English, Irish, and Flemish traders began to ship the wines. Around 1500, sherry wines further benefited from free trade agreements with France and England, and after Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue to the Americas from his base in Andalusia, large volumes of sherry were shipped to America. The next few centuries saw both challenging and prosperous periods for the sherry industry. A number of events, including the Peninsular Wars in the early 1800s, then phylloxera in the late 1800s, devastated the industry. Yet in calmer periods, several successful shipping businesses were established. The popularity of sherry in the late 1800s and early 1900s meant that other countries began to produce their own, often poor quality imitation sherries. This led to the creation of Spain's first wine-related regulatory council, the Consejo Regulador, in 1935. This organization set regulations to control the production and trading of sherry wines. However, they couldn't prevent other countries from producing imitation sherry. Although sherry sales fell during the Second World War, sales recovered in the decades afterwards. Sherry sales peaked in the 1970s, with shipments reaching 1.5 million hectoliters in 1979. However, in the following decades, sales halved as younger generations of consumers sought different styles of wine. During the boom years, sherry production rose dramatically to meet demand, but as demand fell away, much production became surplus. This surplus was largely formed of cheaper and lower quality wines. Ruiz Mateos S.A., also known as Rumasa, was one business that played a key part in the production of cheaper wines. Rumasa started as an almacenista, see wine law and wine business, before starting to ship its own sherry in 1950. The company began to supply Harvey's of Bristol, a UK wine merchant that historically imported large quantities of sherry for their own brands. Rumasa became a major supplier for the brand Bristol Cream, and by doing so, Rumasa accumulated considerable wealth. Rumasa began to build a business empire, taking over not only a number of sherry wine companies or bodegas, but also other businesses such as hotels and banks. By the late 1970s, Rumasa dominated the sherry industry, and through consolidation of production facilities drove down prices. This strategy would negatively affect the sherry industry for decades to come. In 1983, the Spanish government nationalized Rumasa, claiming that it owed millions in unpaid taxes. Its sherry bodegas were sold, which caused a substantial rise in unemployment and social unrest. In addition, a large number of other bodegas closed, sold, or merged as they were unable to sustain themselves in a market burdened with large quantities of low-quality wines. In these difficult times, brands changed ownership multiple times. Since the early 1980s, the Consejo Regulador has been working to rebalance supply and demand and improve the quality of sherry. This has involved bringing vineyard plantings, stock levels, and sales back into better alignment and promoting sherry as a quality product. The growing environment and grape growing. Location and climate. Jerez is located in Andalusia in southern Spain at the low altitude of 36 degrees north, and at low altitude from 0 to 90 meters above sea level. The climate is hot Mediterranean, with hot, dry summers and mild, relatively rainy winters. The region faces west, directly towards the Atlantic Ocean, which gives rise to a cool, damp wind called the poniente. In the summer, this cooling, humid influence is important for sherry maturation. See maturation below. The Levante, a hot, drying wind from North Africa, which is only about 100 kilometers south from Jerez, can make Jerez's climate more arid. This additional heat and wind can cause grapes to transpire more quickly, which concentrates sugars. Too much sugar can be a challenge because it may become difficult to ferment base wines to dryness. This is a particular issue for the development of floor yeast, which is integral to the style of some sherry wines. See biological aging. Jerez also experiences a high number of cloud-free days. This means sunlight hours in the growing season are high, which helps to grow fully ripe grapes. It also means that without sufficient shade, grapes can easily become sunburned. The grapes for sherry must come from the delimited area of around 7,000 hectares known as the Zona de Producción or Marco de Jerez. Grapes grown in this zone can either be used for Denominación de Origen, DO, Jerez Sherry, or DO Manzanilla Sanlúcar de Barrameda. This is also the delimited area for growing grapes for sherry vinegar. There is one exception to this rule. The grape variety Pedro Jimenez, also called PX, can be grown around Montilla, within Andalusia, in the mountains above Malaga, but outside the Zona de Producción, and to be included in wines labeled as DO Jerez. The vineyards of Jerez are also divided into smaller delimited areas called pagos. Each is thought to produce wines with different characters from the other, a function of factors such as aspect, location, and small differences in soil. The 2021 regulations for sherry allow the naming of a pago on the wine label. Soils. The key soil is albaritza, a mixture of limestone, silica, and clay. The limestone was formed from shells of aquatic microorganisms that populated the region approximately 30 million years ago when the area was underwater. The remnants of the shells also created a porous structure within the soil, allowing it to act like a sponge during the rainy season. The water can then be gradually released during the growing season, a vital attribute in a hot region with a dry growing season. Moreover, albaritza soil forms a crust when it dries, which helps to reduce evaporation from the soil surface. The ability of albaritza to retain water means that higher planting densities and yields are possible in Jerez compared to other regions in Spain which also have hot, dry climates. Planting density in Jerez is usually between 3,500 and 4,000 vines per hectare, whereas that of La Mancha's unirrigated bush vines is closer to 1,000 to 2,000 vines per hectare. Jerez yields average 70 hectoliters per hectare compared to 45 for La Mancha. These relatively high yields are also possible because grapes for sherry can have less flavor concentration than grapes for unfortified wines, as most of sherry's flavor comes from the maturation process rather than varietal flavor. The light color of albaritza soil means that it reflects sunlight back onto the vine canopy, which means it can contribute to the ripening of the grapes. The fruit often needs some protection, such as from abundant foliage, to protect from direct sunlight. Other soils in the region include barros, which has greater clay content, and arenas, which is sandy. In practice, the vast majority of vines are planted on the albaritza. Grape varieties. Palomino. Palomino, also called Palomino fino and Listan, is the principal variety. It is used in most dry and sweetened styles of sherry. Palomino accounts for 97% of the Jerez vineyard area. The remaining 3% is equally divided between Muscatel and Pedro Jimenez. Palomino is mid to late ripening, well suited to dry sunny weather thanks to its drought resistance, and capable of producing large yields. It is a neutral variety and therefore does not add much varietal aroma or flavor to sherry wines, which is considered a positive trait. However, the variety loses acidity quickly when it nears maturity, so this trait needs careful management. Muscatel, or Muscat of Alexandria. Muscatel is sometimes called Muscatel de Chipiona after the coastal town of Chipiona, around which it is mainly grown. Soils in this area are generally sandy arena soils. Muscatel is late ripening and well adapted to heat and drought. In contrast to Palomino, Muscatel is an aromatic grape smelling of orange blossom and grape. It is generally used to produce sweet fortified wines of the same name. Pedro Jimenez, or PX. PX is used for the production of sweet fortified sherry labeled Pedro Jimenez, or PX, and as a sweetening agent for other styles of sherry. Grapes accumulate high sugar levels in the hot climate. Bunches are traditionally dried in the sun to concentrate the sugars, a process that is facilitated by the small size of the berry and its thin skin. PX is a neutral variety, and therefore flavors in resulting wines mainly come from the drying and maturation processes. PX accounts for less than 1% of production by volume within the delimited sherry area. However, legislation permits PX to be grown in the Montilla district in the province of Córdoba and shipped to the Zona de Producción either as fresh or raisined grapes, or more likely as a young wine. The new regulations allow the introduction of 6 or 7 new varieties that were grown in the region before phylloxera. They are Beba, Cañocazo, Mantuo, Castellano, Vigariega, Permino, and Mantuo de Pilas. Vineyard management. The sherry vineyards are in the process of being transformed, mainly to accommodate mechanization of all the annual tasks, including pruning, harvesting, soil management. The principal training system used to be head-trained replacement cane pruned, here called vara y pulgar. However, an increasing number of vineyards are now single or double cordon trained, spur pruned, which is much more suitable for mechanization. Both systems use vertical shoot positioning of the foliage to enable the canopy to be well aerated and managed by machine, including some shading of bunches to prevent sunburn. An advantage of cordon-trained spur-pruned vines is that winter pruning can also be mechanized. While within-row spacing can be quite tight at just over 1 meter, between-row spacing is wide enough to allow tractors to pass. Maximum yields permitted by the legislation are 80 hectoliters per hectare. However, it is rare that this maximum is reached. Depending on the year, yields are usually in the range of 60 to 70 hectoliters per hectare. Most vineyards are planted on albaritza soils, which is generally found on gentle slopes of 10 to 15%, about 6 to 9 degrees. Each year after harvest, the soil is worked to create a series of troughs or gullies along the contour of the slopes. These slow runoff, giving more time for water to percolate more deeply. Without these troughs, the rainwater would flow downslope and out of the vineyard. This task, known as acerpia, is very labor-intensive and is therefore mainly done mechanically. The process is reversed in the spring. The most widely used rootstocks are 333EM, 41B, and 13.5 EVEX. These are all hybrids of Vitis vinifera and Vitis berlandieri. The last of these, 13.5 EVX, was developed by the local viticultural research station and has been found to be the most successful to date. Rootstock 13.5 EVEX is tolerant of limestone soils, which prevents chlorosis. It is also drought tolerant and allows the vine to achieve relatively high yields. The dry growing season means disease pressure is relatively low. However, powdery mildew can be a problem in spring due to warm, humid conditions after any rain. VSP training enables the canopy to stay open, which promotes air circulation. This lowers the risk of a fungal disease developing. However, when a disease does develop, systematic fungicides are typically used as treatment. A key pest is the European grapevine moth. It is often managed using pheromone traps. The hot climate means that spring frost is not an issue. The heat also means that harvest typically begins quite early, often in the first week of August. Harvest starts in warmer vineyards further inland and finishes by the second week of September in cooler coastal plots. Harvest tends to be as early as possible to avoid the risk of late autumn rain. Any amount of rot is undesirable, particularly for biologically aged wines. See biological aging. Grapes are usually picked with approximately 12% potential alcohol, total acidity of around 5 grams per liter, and a pH of 3.3 to 3.5. Palomino loses acidity quickly in the final stages of ripening. Therefore, acidification is sometimes required if levels fall much below 5 grams per liter. The PX and Muscatel grapes, for naturally sweet wines, see styles of sherry, tend to be harvested slightly later. A higher concentration of sugar in the grapes when harvested makes the drying process that follows easier and quicker. Around 60% of the total grape volume is harvested by machine, mostly at night or in the early hours of the morning when temperatures are coolest, to reduce chances of oxidation and microbial spoilage. 3.2 Winemaking. Dry wines. Grapes are pressed as soon as possible after they reach the winery. Skin contact is not desired, particularly for biologically aged wines. See biological aging. This is because phenolic compounds can restrict the growth of flora yeast. Biologically aged styles tend to be made from free-run juice and the lightest pressings. The lightest pressings are called the primera yema. Oloroso wines tend to be made from later press fractions called segunda yema, which are extracted using greater pressure. The higher levels of phenolics and later pressings means flora yeast struggles to develop. The final press fractions, or prensas, may be used to prepare new casks for aging by fermenting the prensas in them. The resulting wine is then distilled into a grape spirit. Free-run juice and first pressings typically make up around 60 to 75% of the total juice yield. This means producers who mainly make Oloroso, such as Fundador, may also use free-run juice in these styles. The maximum permitted juice yield is 70 liters per 100 kilograms of grapes. Musts are clarified before fermentation by sedimentation, using a centrifuge, or flotation. Albaritza soil is dusty, and therefore clarification is important to remove these particles from the must. Must adjustments, such as acidification, also takes place at this time. It is common for juice from different vineyard sites to be fermented separately. This creates many base wines that can be blended as needed prior to fortification and maturation. The use of cultured yeast is common, and fortification usually occurs around 22 to 26 degrees Celsius, 72 to 79 Fahrenheit, both of which increase the reliability of fermentation to dryness. The vast majority of the aromas and flavors in Palomino-based sherries are created by the maturation process, so the fermentation temperature can be slightly higher than it would be for a more aromatic wine style. Fermentation generally takes place in stainless steel vats. However, a small number of producers ferment in older barrels to give a fuller body to some base wines. The first phase of fermentation is usually quick and vigorous, as the fermentation temperatures are not particularly cool. The vast majority of the sugar is fermented within the first 7 days. This is followed by a slow phase of fermentation, during which the last of the sugar is fermented. This usually takes a couple of weeks because the increased alcohol in the must reduces the effectiveness of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Malolactic conversion does not occur, partly because the region's climatic conditions result in low acid levels, but, more importantly, Palomino has particularly low levels of malic acid. After fermentation, each batch of base wine will be tasted and sent for analysis. This is known as the first classification, and it decides whether the batch will be used for biological aging, lighter-bodied, less intensely flavored wines, or oxidative aging, fuller-bodied, more intense wines. Base wines destined for biological aging are fortified to 15 or 15.5% ABV. This is the optimum alcohol level for flora yeast to grow. Base wines destined for oxidative aging are fortified to 17% ABV. At this alcohol level, flora yeast are unable to survive. The base wine is fortified with 95% ABV grape spirit, which does not add its own aroma and flavor characteristics to the wine. The 2021 regulations allow base wines that are naturally 15% ABV to remain unfortified, but this point is yet to be approved at the EU level. After fortification, wines are at a stage called sobre tablas. At this stage, the fortified base wines are stored in stainless steel tanks or wooden butts before joining their appropriate Solera system. Sobre tablas are always wines of a single vintage that has just taken place. After a number of months, each vessel of wine marked out for biological aging at the first classification is tasted and analyzed in the second classification. Wines that have developed a full layer of flor and have remained fresh will be classified as potential fino or manzanilla. Those that are slightly less delicate may be marked as palo cortado. Wines marked as fino or manzanilla at the second classification may later move to an amontillado solera system after a longer period of biological aging. Those butts designed for oxidative aging at the first classification are put straight into the Oloroso Solera system. Sweet wines. Naturally sweet sherries have no added sweetening agent. Once harvested, the grapes for naturally sweet wines are laid out to dry in the sun for 2 to 3 weeks. Water evaporates from the grapes, concentrating their sugar levels, and raisin-like aromas develop. The fermentation for these wines stops naturally at 4 to 6% ABV due to very high sugar levels. The wines are then fortified to a concentration of 15 to 16% ABV. They are usually matured oxidatively in their own Solera system, where gradual evaporation causes the sugars and flavors to concentrate further. Not all sweet sherries are made in the above way. Sweetened sherries are made using a palomino that has been fermented dry and fortified. Aging can be biological, oxidative, or a blend of the two. Wines are then sweetened using a sweetening component, such as PX. Sweetening can occur shortly before bottling or before the wine enters a Solera system. Inexpensive wines are likely to be made from relatively young wines that are sweetened just before bottling. Mid-priced and premium wines are likely to be sweetened, then further matured in their own Solera systems. For example, Gonzalez Baez's Matusalem VORS Cream Sherry, ages in a Solera system for 15 years after dry and sweet sherries are blended. Before entering the Solera system, the dry and sweet sherry components have already matured in separate Solera systems for 15 years, giving an average age of 30 years. Maturation. In the past, maturation of wines labeled Dio Jerez had to take place in one of the three municipalities of Jerez de la Frontera, El Puerto de Santa Maria, or Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Together, these were called the Zona de Crianza. However, the 2021 regulations allowed wines to be matured anywhere in the production zone. In contrast, maturation of wines labeled Dio Manzanilla, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, must take place in the municipality of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. The maturation of sherry takes place in old wooden casks. The casks in any one bodega may vary in size, but the most commonly used are 600-liter butts. Butts tend to be made of American oak, primarily for historical reasons. American oak was brought back to Spain during the Spanish conquests of the 1500s. American oak also has the benefit of being cheaper than French oak. Butts are very old, as new wood flavors are not desirable in sherry production. For biologically aged sherries, butts are typically filled to about 500 liters to leave space for floor yeast to develop. The architecture of many bodegas is purposefully designed to create and maintain optimum conditions during maturation without the need for modern air conditioning systems. The traditional bodegas have thick walls, helping to keep their temperatures constant. They are also generally tall buildings with high ceilings, meaning that the warm air rises away from the rows of butts, which are only stacked 3 or 4 butts high. These tall buildings also have small windows positioned high up near the roof. The windows are orientated to allow cool, damp, southwesterly winds from the Atlantic to enter, helping to lower temperatures and raise humidity levels. The windows have thin blinds to diffuse sunlight and prevent dust and insects from entering. The floors are often made of earth, and this can be regularly wetted during the summer to help lower temperatures and increase humidity. The temperatures and humidity in a bodega are especially important for the growth and maintenance of floor as part of biological aging. Despite the effective design of bodegas, there is still some fluctuation in conditions between summer and winter, and therefore growth of floor can often not be maintained throughout the year, although see Fino and Manzanilla in styles of sherry. The Solera system. A Solera system is the process by which most sherry is matured. A Solera is part of the Solera system that contains the oldest wine. Most sherry is a non-vintage product. A Solera system is a method of fractional blending used to maintain consistency and quality year after year. Butts of wine that make up a Solera system are grouped into sections known as criadera, which roughly translates as aging. Butts belonging to the same criadera contain wine of the same age, which is a different age from butts in other criaderas. The wines in each criadera contain wine from more than one vintage. Criaderas are named according to the relative age of wine that they contain. The criadera with the oldest wine is called the Solera. The criadera with the next oldest wine is called the first criadera. The second criadera has younger wine than the first criadera, and the third has younger wine than the second, and so on. Each criadera's butts are stacked together in an area of a bodega. The basic process of fractional blending is as follows. A proportion of wine is taken from each butt in the Solera, the oldest group of butts. The same volume of wine is taken from the butts in the first criadera. This is blended in a tank to ensure consistency across all the butts, and then used to top up the butts in the Solera. In this way, the younger wines from the first criadera are blended with the older wines from the Solera. The same volume of wine is then taken from butts in the second criadera. This is blended in a tank and then used to top up the barrels in the first criadera. This process is repeated for each criadera. Butts in the youngest criadera are topped up with wines from the sobretablas. A key rule of fractional blending is that no more than 40% of the wine from one Solera system can be removed for blending and bottling each calendar year. In this way, each Solera system always retains most of its wine. A further rule is that any wine that is released and bottled for sale must be a minimum of 2 years old. The following image is a simplified illustration of the process. In reality, Solera systems can range from 3 or 4 criadera to a dozen or more, depending on style. The number of criadera, along with the rate and volume of wine extracted, will determine how long it takes to reach the Solera and therefore the age, complexity, and price of the finished wine. Wines do not have to pass through an entire Solera system. Some wine can be removed early for bottling when it reaches the Solera to achieve a less aged or less expensive style. For example, an inexpensive Fino may be made from relatively young wines from the fourth or fifth criaderas, perhaps with a small portion of the first criadera wine to give some complexity. By comparison, a mid-priced or premium Fino may be made with a greater proportion of wine from the Solera and first criadera for their complexity, with some younger wine from the fourth or fifth criadera to give a hint of freshness. Wines from one Solera system can also be blended with wines from a different Solera system during final blending, or some of the wine from one Solera system can be fed into a different Solera system for further maturation. For example, the wine for an Amontillado may undergo 5 years in a Fina Solera system and then 8 years in an Amontillado Solera system. Shoo. Biological aging. Biological aging refers to the practice of maturing wine under a layer of flor yeast. Flor comprises 4 strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. These yeast strains are found on the skins of grapes from the Jerez region. They are also present in the bodegas where the sherry is matured. Under the correct conditions, a layer of yeast naturally forms on the surface of young wine. The wines need to be a maximum of 15.5% ABV. While flor yeast consume alcohol, they struggle to survive at alcohol levels above 16% ABV. It is also important not to add SO2 to the wine, as otherwise flor will be inhibited. Flor also needs plentiful oxygen, therefore sherry butts are left at 85 to 90% full, and the bungs are loosely inserted to ensure the flor is in contact with the oxygen in the headspace of the barrel. Together with the presence of oxygen, temperature, and humidity are critical environmental elements that allow for basic metabolic processes in the yeast to occur, and for reproduction by cellular division. Therefore, maturation bodegas need temperatures between 16 to 20% Celsius, 61 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity levels above 65%. A layer of flor has several influences on wine. First, it protects the wine from oxidation. This means these wines remain pale lemon in color. Second, flor yeasts consume alcohol in the wine and release acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde gives aromas such as apple, apple skin or bruised apple, hay, chamomile, and sometimes a slightly bitter taste. Third, flor yeasts consume glycerol, which gives matured wine a lighter body. Glycerol also has a slightly sweet taste, and low levels of glycerol can contribute to the very dry nature of biologically aged sherries. Flor also lowers levels of acetic acid. The proportions of the 4 strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae flor yeast vary according to different areas of the region, from bodega to bodega, and even over different stages of a Solera system. These variations influence the amount of alcohol consumed and the amount of acetaldehyde produced. Over time in butts, flor yeasts reproduce and die. Dead yeast cells fall to the bottom of the butt, and autolysis takes place. Autolysis can lead to savory, nutty flavors and enhance the texture of a wine. Various other aroma compounds form during the biological aging process due to the reactions between alcohols, acids, and acetaldehyde. These aromas can include green apple, bread, and cheese. As well as maintaining style and quality, a Solera system for biologically aged wines has another important function. Young wines of the Sobretables are rich in nutrients such as alcohol, glycerol, and acetic acid, which flor yeasts consume. As wine matures under flor, these nutrients are used up. The blending of younger wines into older wines therefore helps to replenish nutrient levels in older wines. This enables a thick layer of flor to sustain itself, and which continues to protect the wine from oxidation. The seasonal ebb and flow of flor yeast growth is due to temperature and humidity variation. Partly for the reason of nutrient supply, smaller proportions of wine are usually removed from Fino and Manzanilla Solera systems more frequently throughout the year. Another benefit of removing, bottling, and shipping smaller volumes of wine more frequently is so the wines are fresher when they arrive at the point of sale, instead of having bottled stock sit in a warehouse. This is important for Fino and Manzanilla because these styles do not improve with bottle aging and should be consumed as soon as possible after bottling. Oxidative aging. Oxidative aging is a very different process from biological aging with significantly different influences. With oxidative aging, wine color generally changes from lemon to gold, amber, and then to brown. Alcohol levels increase slightly because water is generally lost from barrels at a quicker rate than ethanol. It is estimated that 3 to 5% of volume is lost each year. Under biological aging, some evaporation also occurs, but consumption of alcohol by floor yeast is more significant, which means alcohol levels decrease. Evaporation also means that other components become more concentrated. Aroma and flavor compounds increase in concentration and evolve from primary characteristics to tertiary oxidative characteristics, such as caramel and nuts. Glycerol levels also rise, which gives oxidatively aged wines a fuller, rounder body than those that have been biologically aged. Other effects of oxidative aging are that acetaldehyde decreases slightly, and levels of acetic acid and ethyl acetate associated with volatile acidity increase slightly. Finishing and packaging. Most sherries are tartrate stabilized, commonly by contact process, fined and filtered prior to bottling. Filtration is particularly important for biologically aged sherries to remove floor yeasts. If floor yeasts were to remain, they could start to redevelop once a bottle is open and exposed to air. Closures can be driven cork, cork stoppers, or screw cap. All sherries must be packed and packaged within the 3 sherry municipalities. 3.3 Styles of Sherry. To be labeled as one of the styles below, wines must conform to certain specifications set by the Consejo Regulador. These specifications include level of residual sugar, typical alcohol content, and other characteristics that are in line with how the wines have been matured. Dry sherries are also known as vinos generosos. Must have a maximum of 4 grams per liter of residual sugar or 9 grams per liter if the wine is more than 12 years old. Fino and Manzanilla. Both Fino and Manzanilla are biologically aged and must spend the entire aging process under a layer of floor. They are pale lemon in color, dry, light to medium bodied with low acidity and low alcohol of 15 to 15.5% ABV. Aromas and flavors depend on the length of maturation in the Solera system and may include aromas associated with acetaldehyde rather than primary fruit, as well as bread dough and almonds. Wine quality ranges from good. Prices range from inexpensive to premium and even super premium. Wines matured in the coastal municipality of Sanlúcar de Barrameda qualify as DO Manzanilla, Sanlúcar de Barrameda. The proximity of this municipality to the Atlantic Ocean means the area has a more maritime climate with milder summers and winters and higher humidity. These less extreme, more humid conditions are ideal for floor yeast growth. Manzanilla Solera systems typically have a thicker, more consistent layer of floor than those in Jerez de la Frontera. In contrast, it is thought that the seasonal changes in temperature in Jerez cause floor yeast to thin during the summer and winter. A thicker, more consistent layer of floor might suggest that Manzanilla should have higher levels of acetaldehyde than Fino, but this is not the case. A possible reason is the differences in floor strains between the two towns. The strain that produces some of the highest levels of acetaldehyde is not present in floor samples taken from Sanlúcar de Barrameda. The greater protection from oxygen and lower levels of acetaldehyde result in Manzanillas that often taste lighter and fresher than Finos. With a thicker layer of floor, Manzanilla Solera systems need replenishing more frequently with young wines to provide nutrients for floor yeast growth. This means smaller volumes of wine are drawn off the Solera and bottled more frequently during the year compared to Fino Solera systems. This ensures that the floor yeast layer is continually maintained. Fino Viejo and Manzanilla Pasada. These wines are made using biological aging. They have a minimum average age of 7 years. Floor yeasts may be left to die naturally by avoiding refreshing the butts with new wine for around a year. Wines may then enter a Solera system for Fino Viejo or Manzanilla Pasada. Amontillado must have attributes from both biological and oxidative aging. Wines start in a Fino Solera system. From there, wines can either be left to age under the layer of floor that has depleted, or wines can be drawn off and refortified to 17% ABV, killing floor yeasts. The wines are then matured oxidatively in an Amontillado Solera system. Regulations do not specify how long wines must age during either stage. Therefore, you could have an Amontillado that had undergone a long period of biological aging, for example 8 years, and a short period of oxidative aging, 2 years, or vice versa. While both would be classified as Amontillado and have a similar total age, they would have very different aroma and flavor profiles. Despite these possible differences, Amontillados always show elements of floor yeast with aromas like apple, almond, and fresh bread, as well as oxidative notes such as spice, herbs, and tobacco. Alcohol is always above 16% ABV. The palate will be completely dry and the wine will have a lighter body thanks to floor yeast's consumption of glycerol. Inexpensive Amontillados are likely to use young biologically aged wines, for example, those taken out of one of the youngest criaderas in a Fino Solera system. These are blended into an Amontillado Solera system, again for a short period of aging. More expensive Amontillados mature for longer, making them more complex. These more complex Amontillados are mid-priced to premium or even super premium. Palo Cortado. Palo Cortado is made from wines that were designated for biological aging at the first classification, but never developed a sufficient layer of flor to enter a fino Solera system at the second classification. Therefore, Palo Cortados are made from fino quality base wine, Primera Yema, but aged oxidatively. They must have similar aromas to those of an Amontillado, but a palate more similar to that of an Oloroso, as a consequence of its oxidative aging once the initial film of flor has disappeared. Palo Cortados are dry, having a residual sugar level under 5 grams per liter. Alcohol level can be between 17 and 22% ABV. As long as these specifications are met, there are no stipulations on winemaking and maturation processes. Wines designated Palo Cortado at the second classification will be refortified to 17% ABV and enter a Palo Cortado Solera system. Because Palo Cortados never enter a fino Solera system, they spend significantly less time biologically aging than Amontillado. This means acetaldehyde aromas will be present, but less prominent than Amontillado. This also means glycerol levels will remain higher than an Amontillado. These factors, combined with the concentration of wine components as part of the aging process, means Palo Cortados usually have a slightly fuller, rounder body than those of Amontillados. Some mid-priced Palo Cortados exist, but more often these wines are premium priced and tend to be very good to outstanding quality. Yummy. Olorosos. These wines gain aromas, flavors, and concentration from oxidative aging. After fermentation, they're fortified to 17% ABV or slightly above to stop flor yeast developing. Olorosos are brown and have dried fruit flavors of raisin or prune, plus oxidative caramel and walnut flavors. The final alcohol level is usually between 18 and 22% ABV. Inexpensive wines, if acceptable to good quality, are drawn out of the Solera system earlier than more expensive, higher quality examples. Long-matured Olorosos are often very good to outstanding quality and premium priced. En Rama. A trend for En Rama sherries has developed in recent years. The term is generally used to describe wines that have been finished and packed in a way that is the best representation of wine straight from the barrel. The 2021 legislation legally defined the term En Rama for the first time. En Rama sherries can be filtered but do not undergo any other stabilization process. They are not clarified, fined, or cold stabilized. Some bodegas also do not filter their En Ramas. For wines that are exported, it is common for a light filtration to be carried out to remove particles of flor. The term En Rama can be applied to any of the above dry styles of sherry: Fino, Manzanilla, Palo Cortados, Amontillados. In practice, Fino En Rama is the most common. En Rama wines tend to taste more intense and complex than a bodega's regular bottling and sell for higher prices. Naturally sweet wines. The most common grape varieties used for naturally sweet wines, or vinos dulces naturales, are PX and Moscatel. Most sherry producers make a single variety PX. PX sherry must have a minimum residual sugar level of 212 grams per liter, but it is usual for them to reach 450 to 500 grams per liter. Wines are full-bodied with a syrup-like consistency. They are low in acidity and have pronounced aromas and flavors of raisins, molasses, and licorice. Alcohol is between 15 and 22% ABV. Single varietal Muscatel is much less common. Muscatel sherry must have a minimum residual sugar level of 160 grams per liter, but it's usual for them to reach 325 to 375 grams per liter. These wines can either be protected from oxygen to give a non-oxidative style, or aged oxidatively in butts for several years. Both styles show the aromatic nature of the Muscatel grape to a greater or lesser extent. Like PX, the alcohol content is typically between 15 and 22% ABV. Both PX and Muscatel wines range from inexpensive to premium in price and from good to outstanding in quality. Both can be used as blending components for sweetened sherries. Sweetened wines. Pale cream. These wines must have undergone a period of biological aging prior to sweetening. Rectified concentrated grape must, RCGM, is generally used as the sweetening component so that it does not add color or its own flavors to the wine. The final sweetness level is between 45 and 115 grams per liter of sugar. These wines frequently have a very light flor character. They will often not be aged for very long, and the sweetening component dilutes some of the flor-derived characteristics. They can be medium sweet to sweet. Most pale cream wines are inexpensive and acceptable to good in quality. Medium and cream. In the past, medium sherries used to show characteristics of both biological and oxidative aging, whereas cream sherries had oxidative characteristics only. Today, both medium and cream sherries can be made from blends of biologically and oxidatively aged wines, or exclusively from one or the other. In practice, however, sweetened wines made exclusively from biologically aged wines will be called pale cream. Medium sherries are almost always a blend of biologically and oxidatively aged wines, and cream sherries are almost always made from Oloroso. Both medium and cream sherries are usually blended with PX for sweetening, but some may be sweetened with RCGM or a blend of both. Medium sherries range from 45 to 115 grams per liter of sugar. Cream sherries must have between 115 to 140 grams per liter of sugar. Both styles range from inexpensive to medium to premium in price and acceptable to outstanding in quality. As with dry sherries, the cheapest wines tend to be made from younger wines, whereas premium examples will be made with a high proportion of well-matured Amontillado, Oloroso, and PX wines. Sherries with an indication of age. There are various categories that can be used to denote sherries that have been aged for long periods of time. VOS and VORS. VOS, Vinum Optimum Signatum, or Very Old Sherry, denotes wines with an average age of 20 years or more. VORS, Vinum Optimum Rare Signatum, Very Old Rare Sherry, denotes wines with an average age of 30 years or more. Each batch of either category released by a bodega is assessed for typicity by a tasting panel. Because these very old dry wines can taste a little astringent, producers are allowed to blend in a little sweet wine, usually PX, as long as the sweet wine does not mask the character of the original wine as judged by the tasting panel. The Consejo Regulador further certifies these wines through laboratory testing and the use of a quota system, which only allows a percentage of existing stock to be sold. VOS and VORS sherries are produced in very small quantities. Very good or outstanding quality, combined with relative rarity, means they sell at premium and super premium prices. 12 and 15-year-old sherries. These are categories for wines with a slightly lower average age. The sherry must still undergo a tasting and laboratory analysis and adhere to the quota system. However, this is carried out for the entire Solera system rather than for each individual batch of wine released. 3.4. Wine law and wine business. Types of businesses engaged in production. The total area of vineyards planted within the Zona de Producción was 7,142 hectares in 2020. At just over 3 hectares, average vineyard holdings are small. Members of cooperatives own 47% of the vineyards, with the shippers owning 31% and independent growers 22%. Although many shippers, such as González Baez, Berbadillo, and the Estaves Group, have large vineyard holdings, they're usually not self-sufficient and need to buy from independent growers. Companies involved in the production of sherry wines are registered within 3 different categories. A company may only belong to one of these registers, or to multiple registers. Bodegas de la Zona de la Producción, production bodegas. Production bodegas, which include large cooperatives, press grapes and ferment must into base wine. They may also fortify the base wine, depending on the style of wine being made and the timing of the fortification. Aging bodegas, see below, may also carry out fortification when needed. Production bodegas are often owned by a company listed on one of the other registers. Others are independent, including cooperatives. These bodegas sell base wine to companies listed on either of the aging bodega registers. Production bodegas can also sell their own wines. Previously, those outside of the 3 municipalities of Jerez de la Frontera, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and El Puerto de Santa Maria did not qualify for DO Jerez or DO Manzanilla Sanlúcar de Barrameda. With the new 2021 regulations, wines can now be aged anywhere in the production zone and qualify for DO status. Bodegas de crianza y almacenado. Aging and storing bodegas. Aging and storing bodegas mature and, when needed for certain wine styles, fortify wines. These bodegas are also called almacenistas. They tend to be relatively small scale, maturing low volumes of wines. Matured wines must be sold to bodegas de crianza y expedición. Bodegas de crianza y expedición. Aging and shipping bodegas. Aging and shipping bodegas are the only bodegas permitted to sell bottled wines from DO Sherry or DO Manzanilla Sanlúcar de Barrameda. These bodegas are also called shippers. As well as selling finished sherries, these bodegas are also permitted to mature wines. Wines may arrive as young wines straight from bodegas de producción, or they may come as matured sherries from the bodegas de crianza y almacenado. Wines from almacenistas, aging in storage bodegas, may be blended with the shipper's own stocks of wines to make up volumes and add complexity. Sherries are generally sold under a shipper's own brands. An exception to this is the shipper Lustau, who has long marketed an almacenista range that, although branded by Lustau, features sherries by individual almacenistas. These sherries include the name of the almacenista on the label. Almacenistas, in particular, have suffered from the declines in sherry sales. As demand reduced, the shippers survived using their own stocks, not needing extra wine from the almacenistas, and consequently, many almacenistas went out of business. In 1996, the Consejo Regulador lowered the minimum stockholding for companies to register as a shipper from 12,500 hectoliters to 500 hectoliters. This meant that a number of the biggest almacenistas, such as El Maestro Sierra and Bodegas Tradición, became shippers and therefore now market their own wines under their own brands. The Consejo Regulador. Sherry's Consejo Regulador was the first to be registered in Spain in 1933. It maintains the vineyard and bodega registers. The Consejo Regulador sets production parameters such as maximum yields and minimum alcohol levels for base wines. It also oversees the rotation of stock in bodegas and verifies the authenticity of age-dated sherries. The Consejo Regulador is also a major promotional body, engaging in many forms of marketing. Marketing activities range from organization of events during International Sherry Week to running educational courses for wine professionals. Sherry was historically used as a generic term for fortified wine made with white grapes. It was only in the mid-1990s that the Consejo Regulador successfully campaigned for the term sherry to only be used within the EU for the wines of Dio Jerez Sherry and Dio Manzanilla Sanlúcar de Barrameda. See above for examples of wine legislation and labeling terms regulated by the Consejo Regulador. Sherry sales. Sales volumes of sherry peaked in the late 1970s at around 150 million liters. Sales have been declining since then. In 2023, global sales of sherry were 25.8 million liters. This is a decline from 46 million liters 15 years earlier. Sales of sweetened sherries have declined by more than 50%, from 28.4 million liters in 2006, the first year for which detailed figures are available, to 12.8 million liters in 2023. Between those years, cream sherry sales declined from 12.5 million liters to 5.4 million liters. Medium sherry declined from 11.8 to 4.2 million liters. Pale cream declined from 4.1 to 1.8 million liters. The UK remains the major market for pale cream, accounting for 90% of exports. Sales of dry sherries have also declined. During the same time span, sales of Fino declined from 14 to 5.3 million liters. Manzanilla sales have declined less rapidly, from 8.5 to 6.2 million. Manzanilla is the style most consumed in the domestic market. See below. Volumes of Palo Cortado, Pedro Jimenez, and age-indicated sherries are small. However, they've all become a valuable and profitable part of most shippers' portfolios. The domestic market is the biggest market, with sales of 11.5 million liters in 2023, which is a 44% share of total sales. The domestic market has shown stability of sales in the 5 years to 2023. Manzanilla, followed by Fino, are the most popular styles. The UK is the largest export market, with sales of 6.9 million liters in 2023. Most of this volume is of sweetened sherries. Holland is the second largest export market with 2.5 million liters, and then Germany with 1.3 million liters. In the last decade, sales volumes have declined in all of these export markets. The above sales volume data are provided by the Consejo Regulador. The organization does not publish value data. However, reports from some markets, such as the UK, suggest sales of premium price sherries are increasing. Premium sales are reported to be primarily driven by the hospitality sector, such as modern tapas bars, and in the use of sherry in cocktails, as well as by younger drinkers. The 2021 regulations allow the production of unfortified sherry wines labeled Dio Jerez or Sherry, and Dio Manzanilla Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Where base wines naturally reach 15% ABV, fortification is no longer necessary. Additionally, unfortified light wines have been made in the region for a number of years, but they are currently not allowed under either DO. These unfortified wines are often made from Palomino or PX in a range of styles: fresh and youthful, biologically aged, partially oxidative. It is hoped that this innovation will attract new customers and new interest in the region's wines. All right, I'm going to take a breath, and then I'll read the next chapter, which is on port. Stay tuned, find port, follow, subscribe, all of those fun things.